The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life. Not because Tuesday held any particular significance, but because she had been in the middle of mending a torn hem on her good winter coat when Margaret, the household maid, brought it to her on a silver tray with the careful expression of someone who already knew the contents and had been rehearsing how to hold her face. Evelyn set down her needle. She looked at the envelope. Her sister's name, Clara, was not on it. The Hartwell family seal was. She already knew before she broke the wax. Clara Ann Hartwell. Blackthorne had died on the 14th of January, 1878, at the estate of her husband, Victor Blackthorne, in the frontier settlement of Blackstone Ridge, somewhere in the high country of Montana Territory. The cause, as relayed through the letter's careful, bloodless language, was listed as a fever of the lungs. It was the kind of language that said nothing while appearing to say everything. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and sat very still for approximately 1 minute before she allowed herself to feel anything at all. Clara had been 26 years old. She had gone west 18 months ago as a bride, carrying 3 trunks, a second-hand piano score of Chopin's nocturnes, and a brave smile she'd shown Evelyn at the train platform while her eyes said something entirely different. "I don't want to go." That was what those eyes had said. But Clara hadn't spoken it, and Evelyn hadn't named it, because the Hartwell family did not discuss things that had already been decided. Now Clara was in the ground, and Evelyn was reading a letter that did not ask whether she was all right. It told her when to pack. She was given 4 days. Her father, Edmund Hartwell, conducted the conversation from behind his desk in the way he conducted all difficult conversations, with the posture of a man explaining an unfortunate but necessary business matter, and the expectation that no one would be foolish enough to make it personal. "The Blackthorne arrangement represents a significant portion of our Western holdings," he said. "Victor is a reasonable man. He has agreed to the transition." Evelyn stood in front of the desk. She was 23 years old. She was not, at that moment, feeling particularly reasonable herself. "Clara has been dead for 3 weeks," she said. "Yes." "And you've already arranged—" "The arrangement protects both families." He shuffled a paper that didn't need shuffling. "Victor has 2 children from his first wife, and now he's lost Clara. He needs stability. We need the mining contracts to remain intact. You are unmarried. The solution is straightforward." "The solution," Evelyn said carefully, "involves sending me to marry a man I've never met, in a place I've never been, weeks after my sister died there." Edmund Hartwell finally looked up from his desk. His expression was not unkind exactly. It was something worse. It was tired, like he'd already had this conversation in his head and arrived at the same conclusion and couldn't understand why she was making him say it out loud. "Your sister understood duty," he said. "I expect the same from you." Evelyn thought of a great many things she could say in that moment. She thought of Clara's face at the train platform. She thought of the letter that had given her 4 days and offered no condolences. She thought of the word transition, used in reference to a dead woman, as though Clara had been a season, something that simply turned. She said none of it. She went upstairs and began to pack. The journey west took 11 days by rail and then 2 more by coach, and then a final day and a half by a supply wagon driven by a taciturn man named Gus, who smelled of tobacco and wet wool and said approximately 40 words across the entire stretch, from the last proper town to Blackstone Ridge. The mountains were enormous. The cold was a different animal than the cold Evelyn knew. It didn't just chill you, it pressed against you, deliberate and patient, like it had all the time in the world and was simply waiting for you to make a mistake. She'd brought 2 trunks, a satchel of books, and the photograph of Clara she kept on her nightstand at home. She'd left the photograph in the satchel rather than looking at it on the train, because every time she opened the flap and saw the edge of the frame, something in her chest lurched sideways, and she couldn't afford that. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was walking into. She read instead. She watched the landscape change from the flat order of the East to something raw and less interested in human concerns. The plains stretched out indifferent and enormous. The sky was the kind of pale winter gray that made everything below it look small. Evelyn had grown up in a house with 12 rooms and polished floors and curtains that matched the wallpaper, and she was beginning to understand, mile by mile, that none of that was going to mean a thing out here. She was 3 hours from Blackstone Ridge when the coach stopped. It stopped wrong, lurching, sudden, with a crack that sounded like a wheel hitting something or braking against something, and then a shout from the driver that was cut short in a way that didn't suggest the wheel. Evelyn was thrown against the door of the coach. The two other passengers, a traveling merchant and his clerk, scrambled upright. Then she heard the horses and the voices outside, and understood. There were 4 of them. She couldn't see them clearly through the frosted window, but she could hear the flat authority in the one doing the talking, the kind of voice that had done this before and was mildly bored by the routine of it. He was saying something to the driver. The driver was not saying much back. The merchant beside her went the color of old paper. His clerk gripped the seat. Evelyn was thinking, quite specifically, that she did not come this far to be robbed on the side of a mountain road. She was also thinking that she had no practical means of preventing it, which was a genuinely infuriating combination of thoughts to have simultaneously. Then the coach door opened. The man who opened it was not one of the 4. He came from the other side of the road, from the tree line, she realized, which meant he'd been there before the coach stopped, which meant he'd seen them coming. He was tall, dark-coated, with the kind of face that had been outdoors long enough that the cold had become part of it rather than something that bothered it. He had a rifle in one hand, not raised, held loose at his side in the way that people who know how to use a thing hold it when they want you to understand that they know. He said without looking at her, "Stay in the coach." Then he walked toward the front. What followed was brief and considerably less dramatic than Evelyn had been bracing for, which was almost more unsettling than if it had gone the other way. There were words she couldn't fully make out, a long silence, and then the sound of horses moving off into the trees at a pace that suggested they'd been persuaded rather than chased. The driver climbed back onto his seat. The merchant exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since birth. The man reappeared at the coach door. Up close, he was younger than she'd initially registered, late 20s probably, though something about the way he held himself read older. There was a badge on his coat that she noticed only after she'd already looked at his face, which was the kind of face that was harder to read than most. Not unfriendly, not exactly warm, either. Careful, she thought. The face of someone who measured things before committing. "Road's clear," he said. "You're about 3 hours out from Blackstone Ridge if Gus doesn't stop to rest the horses." Gus, apparently, was the supply wagon driver who had joined their caravan 2 towns back and was now sitting on his perch, looking like the whole affair had confirmed something he'd always suspected about the world. "Thank you," Evelyn said. The man nodded. He glanced at her trunk, half visible through the coach window, and then at her, with the brief, assessing look of someone putting something together. "You heading to the ridge?" "Yes." He didn't ask why, which she appreciated. He said, "Town's got a sheriff. He's decent. If you need anything when you get there, his name is Aldous Crane. Tell him Rhett Callahan sent you." He said it the way someone says the name of a tool, practically, without ceremony. Then he stepped back from the coach and let the driver move on. Evelyn watched him through the rear window as the coach pulled away. He stood in the road for a moment, watching them go, and then turned back toward the tree line. She filed his name away in the part of her mind that kept track of things she might need later. Rhett Callahan. She didn't know then how much weight that name was about to carry.
I see.
Blackstone Ridge announced itself, as remote frontier settlements often do, through smell before sight, wood smoke and animal and the particular damp metal scent of ore country. Then the road curved around a rock formation, and there it was. A main street of maybe a dozen buildings, false-fronted and listing slightly against the cold. A livery. A mercantile. A saloon with a light in the window that was doing its best impression of warmth. Beyond it, higher up the ridge, a larger structure that could only be the Blackthorn estate, lit against the gray sky like a lantern held over deep water. Gus delivered her trunks to the estate gate without ceremony and was gone before the door opened. The man who met her there was not Victor Blackthorn. It was a woman in a gray dress. The housekeeper, Evelyn would learn, whose name was Mrs. Dodd, and who had the kind of politeness that was armor rather than friendliness. She was shown to a room. She was told dinner would be at 7. She was left alone. The room was fine. The room was in fact considerably nicer than she'd expected. Heavy curtains, a real bed, a writing desk near the window. It was also, she noticed after Mrs. Dodd left, the room with the lock on the outside. She stood looking at that lock for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the room instead. At the curtains, the desk, the particular angle of the window, and thought Clara was here. Not speculation. Knowledge, the kind that settled in her body rather than her head. She crossed to the desk and opened the top drawer and found nothing. She opened the second drawer and found a folded handkerchief, white linen, embroidered at the corner with a tiny C. She held it and didn't breathe for a moment. Then she folded it again and put it in her coat pocket and went to wash her face before dinner. Victor Blackthorne was, by most external measures, an impressive man. He was 43, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvering at the temples in the way that tends to make men look distinguished rather than old. He dressed well, better than you'd expect from someone this far into the territory, and he had the practiced ease of someone who had spent years understanding that the way you move through a room was its own form of power. He stood when she entered the dining room. He smiled. He said he was grateful she'd made the journey and that he hoped the road hadn't been too difficult. He said all of this without once acknowledging that her sister was dead. Not a word. Not even a glancing reference. No, I know this is a difficult time, or Clara spoke of you often. Nothing. He simply handed her a glass of wine and asked about the weather in Philadelphia, as though they were meeting at a garden party rather than in the house where her sister had died 6 weeks ago. Evelyn said the weather had been cold and asked whether the children would be joining them for dinner. Something shifted in his face, nearly imperceptible, a tightening around the eyes. The children take their meals in the nursery, he said. They're still adjusting. To what? She asked, and kept her voice entirely pleasant. To the changes, he said, and refilled his wine glass. She watched him across the table and thought about the lock on the outside of her bedroom door. She thought about Mrs. Dodd's practiced politeness that offered nothing behind the surface of it. She thought about the way everyone in this room, the 2 serving staff who came and went with plates, moved with a particular quality of attention that wasn't quite the attention of people doing their jobs. It was the attention of people who knew they were being watched and had learned to be very careful. I understand the wedding is planned for next month, she said. 3 weeks, he said. I thought it best to proceed efficiently. I hope that's agreeable. The word agreeable sat between them. Of course, Evelyn said. She ate her dinner and answered his questions and gave him nothing that mattered, and when she finally excused herself and walked back down the hallway to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself think clearly for the first time since she'd arrived. Something was wrong here. Not the vague wrongness of grief, not the jarring wrongness of displacement. Something specific and structural, the way a building can look sound from the outside and have rot in the bones. She didn't know yet what she was going to do about it. She only knew that she was going to have to be very careful and very patient, and that she could not afford to trust anything she hadn't tested herself. She took the handkerchief from her coat pocket and set it on the nightstand. She looked at the small embroidered C in its corner. I'm here, she said quietly, to no one in particular, to Clara, to the room, to the cold beyond the window. I don't know what happened to you yet, but I'm going to find out. The children were named Thomas and Lily. Thomas was 9 years old and Lily was 6, and they were, Evelyn understood immediately upon meeting them, not adjusting. They were surviving, which is a different thing entirely. She found them the following morning in the narrow corridor outside the nursery, standing very still against the wall as one of the older serving women passed with a tray. They didn't speak. They didn't move until the woman was gone. Thomas watched the space where she'd been for an extra moment before he noticed Evelyn. He didn't smile. He looked at her the way children look at something they don't trust yet, but are trying to evaluate fairly, carefully, without the pretense of warmth they hadn't decided she'd earned. You're the new one, he said. My name is Evelyn, she said. I was Clara's sister. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Lily, who had positioned herself slightly behind his shoulder, looked out at Evelyn from that cover with eyes that were impossibly large in her small face. She was nice, Lily said, almost a whisper. She used to sing when she thought nobody was listening. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. She kept her face still. She did at home too, she said. Badly. She was genuinely terrible at it, but she liked it so she didn't care. It was the right thing to say. Something in Thomas's expression shifted, barely, but there. The calculation softened by a fraction. Papa says we're not to talk about her, he said. I see, Evelyn said. He says it's not good for us to dwell. His voice was flat, reciting rather than speaking. The voice of a child who had been told something enough times that he could reproduce it, but hadn't decided whether he believed it. What do you think? She asked. Thomas looked at her steadily. I think grown-ups say that when they want you to forget about something, he said. He was 9 years old and apparently already understood more about the mechanics of power than most adults Evelyn had met at dinner parties in Philadelphia. She looked at him and thought, Clara, you were worried about these children. I can feel it. Well, she said carefully, I don't think you should forget her, and I'm not going to forget her either. So if you ever want to talk about her, about who she was, things she said, anything, you can talk to me. Lily came out from behind Thomas's shoulder, just slightly. She taught me to braid, she said. She was better at that than singing, Evelyn confirmed. For the first time, very briefly, Lily Blackthorne almost smiled. She met Rhett Callahan again on the 4th day. She'd gone into town, with Mrs. Dodd's permission, extracted through the polite fiction that she needed thread, and a particular kind of hairpin available only at the Mercantile, primarily because she needed to see the town, to understand what Blackstone Ridge was beyond the estate gates. What she found was a settlement in the specific posture of a place that had learned to be careful. People who moved quickly between buildings, who spoke in lower tones than the open air required, who looked at her with expressions that registered recognition and then deliberately did not. They knew who she was. They knew whose house she'd come from, and they were afraid, she understood, not of her specifically, but of what her presence meant and who she was connected to. She was at the Mercantile counter when she heard his voice, low, to the shopkeeper, asking about a supply order, and turned to find Rhett Callahan leaning against the counter 2 feet away, looking equally unsurprised to see her. Miss Hartwell, he said. Mr. Callahan. She studied him. In better light than the roadside had offered, he had the look of someone who hadn't always been a frontier lawman. There was something more deliberate about him than most of the men she'd passed on the main street, like he'd made choices that brought him to this particular patch of territory and hadn't stopped paying attention since. You said you were a deputy. I did. I went looking for the sheriff, Aldous Crane. The woman at the dress shop told me he'd had an accident, broke his leg. Last week, Rhett said. He's mending. So you're managing? Something like that. She looked at him. He looked at her. The shopkeeper had found something vitally important to examine on the other end of the counter. I want to ask you something, Evelyn said, keeping her voice low. And I'd like a straight answer rather than a careful one. He didn't say anything. She took that as permission. My sister died in that house, she said. They told my family it was a fever of the lungs. She was 26 years old and healthy the last time I saw her, which was 14 months ago. She wrote me letters. Not often enough, but she wrote. And the last 2 were different from the others. Shorter, like she was choosing what not to say. And then she stopped writing, and then she was dead. She paused. Has anyone looked into how she died? Rhett was quiet for a moment. Something was happening in his expression that was hard to read. Not surprise exactly, which told her something in itself. The county doctor signed the death certificate, he said finally. Fever of the lungs. That's not an answer to what I asked. Another pause. He looked at the counter, then back at her. No, he said. No one looked into it. Victor Blackthorne has the county doctor's ear and the county commissioner's vote, and 3 lawyers in Bozeman who are very good at paperwork. In a town this size, that's a considerable amount of persuasion. And you? She asked. What do you have? A questionable jurisdiction and a sheriff with a broken leg, he said. It might have been a kind of dry humor, or it might have been simple honesty. She couldn't tell which. Miss Hartwell, what is it you think you're walking into? I don't know yet, she said. But I think I was sent here for the same reason my sister was. And I think whatever happened to her, nobody here was going to say anything about it because they couldn't afford to. She met his eyes. I'd like to not disappear the same way. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then you'd better be careful who you trust, he said, and what you do with what you find. I'm aware of that, she said. I'm telling you because you have a badge and because you handed me your name 4 days ago on a mountain road when you didn't have to, which I took as an indication of something. It was an indication that I thought you might need someone in town to know, he said. Blackthorn's estate gets more visitors than it keeps. That's not something most people say out loud here. I'm saying it, she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he gave her a very small nod that wasn't agreement exactly, but was something, an acknowledgement, maybe, that she was paying attention to the right things. Be careful in that house, he said. Don't go looking for things where the staff can see you. And if something happens, if you feel unsafe, get to town. Don't wait and don't explain. She bought her thread. She bought the hairpin. She walked back to the estate with Mrs. Dodd 2 steps behind her and acted like a woman who had done nothing more interesting than run an errand. She found the journal on the 11th day. It was not where it should have been, not in a drawer or on a shelf or in any of the places a journal might logically sit. She found it because she'd been methodical, because she was her father's daughter, in that respect at least, and because she'd spent 10 days learning the house's rhythms, when the staff moved, where Victor went in the evenings, which rooms Mrs. Dodd attended on which mornings. She'd been patient. She'd been pleasant. She'd had dinner with Victor 5 times and answered his questions and asked easy ones in return, and she had watched him the way you watch something that might be dangerous. Not with fear, but with the careful, sustained attention of someone who knows that what they're looking at has the capacity to hurt them and intends to understand it completely before anything else. The journal was behind the false back of the small decorative cabinet in the room that had been Clara's sitting room, converted now into a kind of study for Victor's use. She found it in the 20 minutes when Victor was at the mill and Mrs. Dodd was in the kitchen and both serving staff were occupied with the laundry. She'd worked the back panel loose with the kind of care that meant she could replace it exactly as she'd found it. The journal was small, leather-bound, the pages filled with Clara's handwriting, tighter than Evelyn remembered, more compressed, as though she'd been trying to fit more into less space, as though she'd known she might not have much time. She didn't read it there. She put it in the deep inner pocket of her coat and walked back to her room and sat on the bed and opened it to the first page. She read for 2 hours. What she found there was not a story she'd allowed herself to fully imagine, even in the darkest corners of what she'd suspected. Clara's first entries were from 8 months ago, careful, circumspect, written like someone who knew they might be found out. She described the house in terms that were factually neutral but emotionally cold. She described Victor in terms that started measured and grew, over weeks, into something that read like fear translated into very controlled language. She described the first wife, a woman named Margaret, Victor's first wife who had died 3 years before Clara arrived, and how none of the servants would speak of her, and how the children had a particular silence when her name came up that Clara had initially attributed to grief. Then she wrote about the headaches she'd been having, then the nausea, then the weeks when she felt better, then worse again, then better. In a pattern that made no sense until the evening when she'd overheard a conversation she hadn't been meant to hear and understood what she was looking at. Clara had written, in her tightest handwriting on a page near the back, "I believe he is doing it slowly. I believe he did it to Margaret. I don't know what is in the tea he has brought to me each evening. He has made a point of bringing it himself, which I thought was thoughtfulness, and now understand differently. I have stopped drinking it. I pour it out. He hasn't noticed yet. I am trying to find out who I can trust. I am trying to find proof. If something happens to me before I can get this to someone, let it be enough. Let it be something. Let whoever finds this know that I didn't get sick. I was made sick." The last entry was dated 9 days before Clara died. It was 3 words only. He found it. Evelyn sat with the journal in her hands and looked at the far wall and felt something settle in her. Not calm, exactly. Something harder than calm. Something that had no patience left in it for pretending. She thought of Victor's hand refilling her wine glass at dinner. She thought of the tea Mrs. Dodd brought each evening to her room, which Evelyn had been drinking because she'd been cold and tired and hadn't thought about it. She set the journal down, stood up, crossed to the washstand, and emptied the remaining tea from the cup she'd half finished into the basin. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she went to her writing desk, sat down, and began writing a note. She didn't seal it. She folded it into her coat pocket alongside the journal and thought about timing. She thought about what Rhett had said. If you feel unsafe, get to town. Don't wait and don't explain. She was not going to wait. She dressed in her warmest coat. She looked at the room, the curtains, the desk, the nightstand with Clara's handkerchief still sitting on it. She picked up the handkerchief and put it in her pocket. She picked up her satchel with the books and the photograph and nothing else that she couldn't carry easily. She left the trunks. She opened the bedroom door quietly, listened to the house, and walked toward the servants' stairs. She was 6 steps from the back door when Mrs. Dodd stepped out of the kitchen. They looked at each other. Mrs. Dodd's face did something complicated, a whole conversation happening behind it that didn't reach the surface. She looked at the satchel. She looked at Evelyn's coat. She looked at Evelyn's face. "The back door sticks in cold weather," Mrs. Dodd said after a moment. "You'll need to lift it slightly while you turn the handle." Evelyn looked at her. "He isn't," Mrs. Dodd said very quietly. "A man who lets things go. You understand?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Mrs. Dodd stepped aside. Evelyn lifted the handle slightly as she turned it. The door opened. The cold outside was immediate and enormous, and she walked into it without stopping, across the frozen ground behind the estate, toward the ridge road that led to town, with the journal in her pocket and the photograph in her satchel and the specific terrified clarity of a woman who has understood, finally and completely, what kind of house she has been living in. She didn't run. Running was for people who had somewhere close to reach. She walked quickly, steadily, with her head down against the wind, and she didn't look back. She had 3 miles to cover before she reached Blackstone Ridge. She had a journal that could destroy a man, and she had the name of the only person in this territory she was willing to trust. Rhett Callahan. She repeated it to herself like a direction as she walked. As the wind came off the mountain and the cold settled against her, and the estate lights behind her stayed lit in the dark, still and ordinary, not yet knowing she was gone. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she cleared the estate's back fence, and it didn't let up. 3 miles of frozen road between her and Blackstone Ridge, and the wind coming down off the mountain in long, sweeping gusts that found every gap in her coat and stayed there. She kept her head down and walked fast, not quite running, because running on iced ground in the dark was how you ended up with a broken ankle and nobody to find you until morning, but fast enough that her breath came in visible clouds and her feet numbed inside her boots before she'd covered the first half mile. She didn't let herself think too hard about what she'd left behind. The trunks, the room, the careful fiction of a woman settling into her new life, learning the house, counting the weeks to a wedding she had never intended to go through with. All of it abandoned. What she had was the satchel over one shoulder and the journal in her inner pocket and the handkerchief with Clara's embroidered C pressed against her ribs, and she told herself that was enough. It had to be enough. The lights of the town appeared after what felt like longer than 3 miles. It always does, in cold like that, when you're alone and the dark is thorough and your mind keeps offering you thoughts you'd rather not have. She walked toward them the way you walk toward the only lamp in a large room, with the particular relief of something that hasn't gone out yet. The sheriff's office was on the far end of the main street, a low building with a light in the window that suggested someone was still awake at this hour, which was late enough that the saloon had gone quiet. She pushed the door open and the warmth inside hit her so suddenly that she stopped in the doorway for a moment, just breathing it. Rhett Callahan was at the desk. He had papers in front of him and a cup of something that had probably been coffee 2 hours ago, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been waiting for bad news long enough that he'd stopped being surprised when it arrived. He took one look at her, the satchel, the coat, the fact that she was alone and had clearly walked from somewhere, and stood up. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No? Did someone see you leave?" "Mrs. Dodd." She came fully inside and pulled the door shut. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she registered with some irritation as she worked the buttons of her coat. "She let me go, told me the door sticks in the cold." Something passed across his face that was hard to name. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe a little more." She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out the journal, set it on the desk in front of him. "I need you to read this." He looked at it without touching it. "What is it?" "My sister's journal." She sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited, because her legs had decided they'd done enough for one evening. She believed Victor was poisoning her. She believed he'd done it to his first wife before her. She was trying to find proof when she died. She paused. The last entry is 9 days before her death. It says he found it. The journal. Rhett picked it up then. He opened it carefully, like he understood what it was, and read the first page in silence, then several more. He read the way someone reads when they're not just taking in words but building something from them, measuring, cross-referencing against things they already know. He set it down. "There's a man," he said. "Works at the estate. Former stable hand named Decker. He left Blackthorn's employment about 7 months ago. Nobody asked him why, and he didn't volunteer it, but he's been quiet in a particular way since the way people get quiet when they know something they don't know what to do with." He looked at her. "I've been watching that house for a year, Miss Hartwell." She absorbed this. "You suspected." "I suspected. Suspecting and proving are different problems, especially when the man you're suspecting has the county commissioner in his pocket." He leaned back in his chair, something shifting in his expression. Frustration, old and worn down from long use. "The first wife, Margaret. She died 4 years ago. Same story, fever, quick decline, county doctor signed off without blinking. Victor was through his grief and had business interests in Philadelphia within the year, which is how he found Clara." "It's he." "What?" He paused. "Your family. My father's business interests and his complete failure to ask obvious questions," Evelyn said. She said it flatly, without particular bitterness, because she'd already spent the 3-mile walk working through the bitterness and arriving at something colder and more useful on the other side of it. "The journal isn't enough on its own," Rhett said. "It's a dead woman's private writing. Blackthorn's lawyers will call it the work of a sick, frightened mind, someone feverish and confused who wrote down delusions. We need physical evidence. We need someone who can testify to what they saw." "Mrs. Dodd knows something," Evelyn said. "She didn't step aside because she's careless. Mrs. Dodd has 3 children and a dead husband, and she's been in that house 12 years. She knows exactly what stepping forward means." He looked at Evelyn steadily. "You can't go back." "I know. He'll look for you when he realizes you're gone. He'll come to town first." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I need somewhere to stay that isn't obvious, and I need time to think about what we do next." He thought for a moment. "Aldous?" he said. "Sheriff Crane. His wife has a spare room, and they've got enough years in this territory that Blackthorn doesn't scare them the way he scares most people. I'll take you there now." "At this hour?" "Aldous doesn't sleep well with a broken leg. He'll be awake, and he'll be glad of the company." He stood reaching for his coat. "One thing, Miss Hartwell." "Evelyn," she said, "we're past formalities." He paused at that briefly. "Evelyn, Victor Blackthorn is going to come into town tomorrow, and he's going to tell a story about you. He's good at stories. He's had practice." He looked at her directly, without softening it. "Whatever he says, whatever version of you he puts in front of this town, you need to be prepared for the fact that some people are going to believe him. Not because they're bad people, but because he's been here longer than you, and because it's easier to believe the man with the money than the woman who showed up 3 weeks ago and then ran." Evelyn held his gaze. "Then we'd better find the evidence before he finishes telling the story," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "We'd better." "What?" Sheriff Aldous Crane was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades persuading mountains to move and currently confined to an armchair in his front room with his splinted leg elevated on a stool and an expression of supreme personal offense at being so confined. His wife, Nora, had the brisk, capable quality of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the frontier could produce, and she opened the door to Rhett's knock at 11 at night with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something of this nature, if not this precisely. She showed Evelyn to the spare room, brought her a blanket and a glass of water, and said, "We'll sort out the rest in the morning. Sleep if you can." Evelyn didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark, listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about Clara. Not the Clara in the journal, the one writing in tight, frightened sentences about headaches and tea she'd stopped drinking, but the Clara at the train platform 14 months ago with the brave smile and the eyes that said something else. "I don't want to go." She should have said something. They both should have said it. The Hartwell family didn't discuss things that had already been decided, and 2 young women had been trained since childhood not to push against what was decided. And Evelyn was lying in a stranger's spare room in a frontier town because that training had cost her sister's life and nearly cost her own. She made herself a quiet, unglamorous promise in the dark. She was going to finish what Clara had started. She was going to make it mean something. Victor Blackthorne arrived in town the following morning at 9 o'clock, which was earlier than Evelyn had expected, and told her he was more alarmed than he'd intended to appear. She watched from the window of Aldous Crane's front room as he came down the main street on horseback. Two men she didn't recognize flanking him at a respectful distance. He was dressed well, as always. He moved with the same deliberate ease she'd observed across the dinner table, the ease of a man who had never, in his memory, failed to be in control of a situation. He went first to the sheriff's office, which was Rhett's territory, which told her he didn't yet know where she was. Aldous, from his armchair, had received a full account of the situation with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of useful occupation. His broken leg appeared to cause him physical pain approximately every 40 minutes, and at no point seemed to affect his thinking. "He'll go to the commissioner next," Aldous said, when Rhett returned an hour after Victor's arrival to give them a report. "He'll want a formal statement on record that you—" He looked at Evelyn. "Left the estate without permission and are potentially disturbed. He'll frame it as concern for your welfare. He told me," Rhett said, sitting down, "that Evelyn had been exhibiting signs of distress since her arrival, that she'd been confused, prone to imagining things, that the journey west and the grief of her sister's death had affected her mental state. He said she'd fixated on the idea that Clara's death was something other than what it was. Evelyn listened to this the way you listen to a description of something you expected but still find unpleasant. And I told him I hadn't seen anything to suggest that, and that I'd let him know if she turned up." Rhett met her eyes. He wasn't satisfied. He asked if I thought it was appropriate for a woman in that condition to be wandering the territory alone. I told him I thought it was appropriate for people to go where they needed to go. "He won't leave it there," Aldous said. "No," Rhett agreed. "He's talking to people. The mercantile owner. The doctor. He's planting it, the same way you'd plant any story. A word here, a concerned expression there. By tonight, half the town will have a version of it." Evelyn thought of what Rhett had said the night before. Some people are going to believe him. She'd understood it then. She felt it differently now, sitting here, knowing that Victor Blackthorne was walking her main street at this moment, describing her to strangers as a woman too distressed to be trusted. The particular helplessness of having your own character turned into a story someone else tells. She felt it like something physical, a tightening in the throat. "Decker," she said, "the stable hand you mentioned, where is he now?" "He's got a place south of town," Rhett said. "Small spread. He's been doing day labor at the Kelsey Ranch." "Will he talk to us?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but I think we need to try." "Then let's try today," Evelyn said, "before Victor gets further into this town." Decker's place was a 20-minute ride south, a rough practical property that looked like it had been built by someone with modest means and no illusions, a small house and a lean-to barn, and a yard that was more frozen mud than anything else. He was splitting wood when they arrived, which is one of those tasks people do when they're thinking hard and need something to hit. He stopped when he saw them coming. He looked at Rhett with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to arrive and is not sure whether to be relieved or afraid that it finally has. He looked at Evelyn with less certainty. "Heard there was a new woman up at the estate," he said, not moving from his position beside the woodpile. "Evelyn Hartwell," Rhett said, "Clara's sister." Something crossed Decker's face at that. A complicated movement, guilt and sorrow overlapping. He put the axe down very carefully, like he was making a decision. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to know what you saw," Evelyn said, "when you worked there." Decker looked at the ground. He was a large man, mid-30s, with hands that had done hard work long enough that they'd changed shape around it. He shook his head once. Not refusing, she thought. Trying to decide. "I've got 2 daughters," he said. "Victor Blackthorne has lawyers in 3 counties." "I know," Evelyn said. "I have a journal my sister kept before she died, in which she names what she believed he was doing to her and describes what she was trying to find out before it was too late. I need corroboration. I need someone who saw something." She paused. She had 2 children in that house who are still living with him. Thomas is 9. Lily is 6. Whatever she was trying to do before she died, she was trying to protect them too. Decker was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard. A horse in the lean-to shifted its weight. "The tea," he said finally, not looking at her. He made a point of it, preparing it himself, which nobody thought anything of at first, Seemed like the kind of gesture a man makes to his wife. But I saw him once, in the kitchen when he didn't know I was there. He had something small, a vial, glass, the kind you'd get from a chemist. He put something into one of the cups. Not much, just a few drops. He stopped, started again. I told myself I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. I told myself that for 3 months. Then Mrs. Blackthorne, Clara, got sick. And then she died. And then I couldn't stay there anymore. The silence after that was the kind that needed to be respected for a moment before anyone spoke into it. "Would you testify to that?" Rhett asked quietly. Decker finally looked up. "If there was a case. If you could make it stick. If it wasn't just my word against his." He looked at Evelyn. "Your sister. She was the kind of woman who didn't deserve what happened to her. She used to bring water out to the stable in the hot weather. Little things like that. She didn't have to." Evelyn felt the tightening in her throat again and pushed past it. "There will be a case," she said. "We're going to make one." The problem was time, and the fact that Victor Blackthorne had more of it on his side than they did. By the second day, the story had settled into town the way stories do. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through accumulation. A dozen small conversations that built the same structure from different angles. People who didn't know Evelyn and had no particular reason to disbelieve Victor Blackthorne had been given a narrative that was internally consistent and emotionally satisfying. A grief-stricken young woman, unmoored by loss, who had arrived in an unfamiliar place and become convinced of things that weren't there. Victor had even managed to frame his concern with what sounded like genuine pain. "I only want what's best for her. Her family trusted me to care for her, and I failed to see how fragile she was." It was, Evelyn thought grimly, a masterful piece of work. He'd had practice. "The commissioner has agreed to receive his formal statement tomorrow," Rhett told them that evening, back at Aldous' house. "Which means there'll be a record, which means Blackthorne's lawyers can use it to establish precedent if there's any future proceeding." "What do we need?" Aldous asked. "Physical evidence," Rhett said. "The journal is support, Decker's testimony is support, but if we're going to make a criminal case, we need something concrete. Something that can't be explained away." "The vial," Evelyn said. "He used a glass vial, according to Decker. If he's been doing this, if he did it to Margaret before Clara, those things don't vanish. He'd want to keep control of them." She thought about the estate, the rooms she'd moved through in 11 days, the parts of the house that hadn't been accessible to her. "His study, the private one, not the one he receives visitors in. I never saw inside it. The door was always locked." "You're not going back in there," Rhett said. "I wasn't suggesting I do it alone." He looked at her. The expression on his face was complicated. Something between reluctant respect and the specific exasperation of someone who has already understood that the person they're talking to has made up their mind, and arguing is going to be largely ceremonial. "If Victor sees you anywhere near that estate—" "Victor is in town," she said. "He's been in town for 2 days, making his case to anyone who will listen. He's not going back until he's finished, because walking away from his campaign right now would undermine the story he's telling." She leaned forward. "Which means there's a window, not a large one, but a window." Aldous made a sound from his armchair that could have been agreement or could have been the particular noise he made when his leg bothered him. "She's not wrong," he said. Rhett looked at the ceiling, then he looked back at Evelyn. "I'll go in," he said. "You're not setting foot on that property." "I know the layout of the house," she said. "You don't." "Then you describe it to me. It won't be enough. You don't know which floorboard creaks on the back stairs, or that the study door requires the handle to be turned all the way before you push or it catches, or that Mrs. Dodd takes her supper in the kitchen from 5:30 to 6 precisely, every evening." She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to be reckless. I'm trying to be useful. There's a distance between those two things that I'm not sure you've fully accounted for," he said. "I've accounted for it," she said. "I just think the alternative is worse." Another silence. Rhett ran a hand across the back of his neck, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as the specific physical expression of him working out that he wasn't going to win this and deciding how to make the best of it. "We go in when Victor's occupied," he said. "You wait outside. If I need guidance, you'll be close enough. If something goes wrong, you get back to town." "Agreed," she said, quickly enough that he gave her a look that suggested he knew she'd agreed too fast. "I mean it," he said. if something goes wrong. I said agreed, Callahan. Aldous made the sound again. This time it was definitely amusement. Mom. They went the following evening, in the hour between 5:30 and dark, when the light failed early in winter and the estate sat in the particular blue-gray dusk of the high country. Rhett went over the fence at the east side, where the grounds crew didn't maintain the line as clearly. Evelyn waited at the fence line in the shadow of a stand of bare aspens, and she hated every second of it. She could see the house from where she stood, the lit windows, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the ordinary-looking stillness of a place going about its evening. She kept thinking about Thomas and Lily in there, taking their supper in the nursery, going through whatever small rituals they'd built to manage days in that house. She kept thinking about Clara, who had stood in some of those rooms and known, and been afraid, and tried anyway. Rhett was inside for 22 minutes. She counted, because it was something to do. When he came back over the fence, he was moving with the controlled, deliberate pace of someone carrying something they don't want to drop. He waited until they were back in the tree line before he opened his coat and showed her. 2 things. A small glass vial, stoppered, with a residue inside that caught what was left of the light. And a folded paper, heavy, official-looking, the kind used for formal correspondence, that turned out, when Evelyn unfolded it with shaking hands, to be a letter from a chemist in Bozeman, dated 18 months ago, confirming the order and delivery of a compound she'd never heard of. Arsenic compound, Rhett said, slow-acting, the kind that mimics lung fever. His voice was very even, the way a voice gets when the person using it is working hard to keep it that way. The letter is addressed to Victor Blackthorne by name. Evelyn looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at the vial. She thought about Clara writing he found it in the last entry of a journal she'd hidden behind a false panel and still had found. She thought about Clara at 26, frightened and trying to find a way out, running out of time. "That's enough," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "That's enough to make a case." "It's enough to start one," Rhett said. He was watching her face. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. It was a strange question and a genuine one, and for a moment she didn't know what to do with the directness of it, with being asked that plainly by someone who actually wanted to know the answer. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." He nodded, accepting that without pushing further, which was the right thing to do, and she appreciated it. "We need to get these to Aldous, and we need to move fast. If Victor finds that room has been accessed, we lose the element of surprise." "He'll know someone's been there?" "I was careful. But he'll go back eventually, and he'll notice, because men like Victor always notice. It's how they maintain control. We've got maybe 2 days before he shifts from making his public case to taking direct action." He looked at her. "And when that happens, it's going to get worse before it gets better." She folded the letter back along its creases. She put it in her coat pocket with the journal and the handkerchief. 3 things now, each one a piece of what Clara had been trying to build before it was too late. "Then let's not waste the 2 days," she said. Back at Aldous' house, the old sheriff read the chemist's letter twice and held the vial up to the lamplight and said nothing for a long moment. Nora brought coffee that nobody was really going to drink and stood in the doorway with her arms folded, listening. "County Court," Aldous said finally. "Judge Harlan is in Helena right now, but he rotates through Blackstone Ridge every 6 weeks. He's due in 12 days. He set the vial down with great care on the table beside him. If we can hold this together for 12 days, we can get it in front of someone who isn't on Victor's payroll." 12 days is a long time, Rhett said. "I know it is." Aldous looked at him steadily. "You'll need more than this. Decker will testify." "Who else?" "The children," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. "They're 9 and 6, she said. "I know, but they remember things. Children always do. Thomas said things to me in the first days I was there that he'd been told not to say. He's holding it because he has no place to put it and no one to tell it to." She looked at Aldous. If there was a proceeding with the right questions asked carefully, Thomas would tell the truth. I believe that. Aldous studied her. Getting the children in front of a court means getting them away from Victor Blackthorne. "Yes," she said, "which he will resist." "Yes, which could get ugly." "I know," she said. "But they're in that house right now, and Clara tried to protect them, and someone needs to finish what she started." She paused. I need to get them out before Victor understands how much trouble he's actually in. Because when he does understand it, when he realizes the evidence is gone from that room and that there's a case being built against him, he is not going to sit quietly. The room was quiet. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the kind of cold that pressed against windows and found the places where the caulk had dried out. "I have a brother in Billings," Nora said from the doorway. Everyone looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who had been listening to a problem long enough to have worked out a piece of the solution. "He has a house and a wife and 2 children of his own, and he is not a man that Victor Blackthorne has ever had occasion to influence because he is not the kind of man Victor Blackthorne would bother with." She paused. "He has a spare room. He has a horse and wagon. And if you asked him to bring 2 frightened children south without making a fuss about it, he is exactly the kind of man who would do that and keep his mouth shut." Rhett looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at Nora with the expression of a man who had been married to this woman for 37 years and was still, on occasion, caught off guard by her. "How fast can you get word to him?" Rhett asked. "I can write tonight," Nora said. "He can be here in 4 days if he pushes." 4 days. Which left 8 days before Judge Harlan arrived. Which was enough time if nothing went wrong. If nothing went wrong. Evelyn looked at the glass vial on the table, small and ordinary looking and devastating. She thought about Victor Blackthorne on the main street of this town, planting his story with the patience of a man who was certain of his own immunity. She thought about Decker at his woodpile, holding 12 months of guilty silence that he was finally willing to break. She thought about Mrs. Dodd lifting slightly as you turn the handle. The door sticks in cold weather, and what it had cost that woman to say those 7 words. She thought about Clara's last journal entry, 3 words in small, frightened handwriting. He found it. This time, Evelyn thought, let him find nothing. Let him come back to that room and find the absence of his evidence and understand what that meant. Understand that somebody had gotten there first, that the ground had shifted under him while he'd been busy constructing a story. Let him feel what it was to have the thing you thought was safely buried suddenly missing. Let him feel that the way Clara had felt it, and Margaret before her, and every person in that town who had spent years learning to be careful. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against her coat pocket, where the letter rested against the journal, against the handkerchief, with its small embroidered C. She was not disappearing. She was not running. She was not the grief-stricken, fragile woman that Victor Blackthorne was describing on the main street of this town. She was Clara's sister, and she had 12 days, and she intended to use every single one of them. Victor Blackthorne discovered the room had been accessed on the morning of the 3rd day. Evelyn knew it before anyone told her, because she was watching from Aldous' front window when his horse came down the main street at a pace that was not quite controlled. Not galloping, Victor was too careful for that, but faster than a man of his bearing typically moved through a town where he intended to look untroubled. He had one of his flanking men with him, this time, instead of 2, which told her the other had been sent somewhere else, which told her he was already moving on multiple fronts. "He knows," she said. Aldous looked up from the letter he'd been dictating to Nora. "How long before he makes a move?" "Today," she said. "He won't wait." She was right. Rhett came in 40 minutes later with the particular walk of someone who has been managing several things at once and is running low on patience for all of them. He pulled the door shut, leaned against it, and looked at Evelyn with an expression that had skipped past careful and arrived directly at honest. "He went to the commissioner this morning," Rhett said. "Filed a formal complaint. He's claiming you stole personal property from the estate when you left. Specifically, certain documents and personal effects belonging to his late wife, which he says you took without permission." He paused, letting that land. "It's a legal mechanism. If the commissioner accepts it, he can compel a search of wherever you're staying and recover what was taken." Evelyn understood immediately. "He's not trying to recover anything," she said. "He's trying to get the journal and the chemist's letter back." "Yes." "Does the commissioner know about our evidence?" "The commissioner," Aldous said from his chair with a certain dryness, "has been receiving Victor Blackthorne's hospitality every hunting season for 6 years. I wouldn't count on the commissioner for anything useful right now." "How much time do we have?" Evelyn asked. Rhett crossed his arms. "The commissioner has to process the complaint formally, which takes at least a day. But Victor doesn't necessarily wait for formal processes. He's got the two men with him, and I'd bet there are more he can call on. Men who do work for the mining operation that isn't strictly about mining. He looked at her steadily. We need to move the evidence somewhere he can't touch it, and we need to move it today. Nora's brother, Evelyn said. He's still 3 days out, Nora said from the corner, already thinking ahead of the conversation, already calculating. Then it doesn't go with him, Aldous said. Rhett, Judge Harlan. He's in Helena. I know where he is. Can you reach him? Rhett was quiet for a moment. I can send a wire. Whether he acts on it is another question. Harlan's a fair man, but he's not going to ride 3 days into the territory on the basis of a telegraph message unless I give him something compelling enough to justify it. Then give him something compelling, Aldous said. Give him the chemist's letter, not the original. Copy it out word for word and send it with the wire. If Harlan reads that letter, he'll come. It was a reasonable plan. It was also, Evelyn understood, a plan that depended on a judge in Helena deciding in the next 24 hours that what a frontier deputy was telling him was worth 3 days of winter travel, which was not a guaranteed outcome. What about the children? She asked. The room went slightly quiet. This was the question everyone had been circling around since Nora's brother had been mentioned, the question with the most variables and the least margin for error. 3 days, Rhett said. Nora's brother gets here in 3 days. We can't move them before that. And if Victor decides to take the children somewhere else before 3 days are up? Evelyn asked. If he realizes we're building a case and decides that Thomas and Lily are liabilities rather than assets? Nobody answered immediately because nobody had a good answer. The fire in the grate said something in the language of settling wood. Outside, the wind had dropped, which sometimes meant the cold was getting worse, preparing itself for something more serious. He won't hurt them, Rhett said finally. Not confident, careful. Not the way They're his children, legally. Hurting them gains him nothing. Moving them is different, but he'd need a reason to do that before he knew what we had. He knows something is missing from his study, Evelyn said. He's smart enough to know what that means. He's smart enough to know it, and smart enough to know that panicking in public makes him look like a man with something to hide, Rhett said. He'll move carefully, which buys us time. Not much, but some. She thought about Thomas's face on the first morning, standing in the hallway outside the nursery with his back against the wall. She thought about Lily saying she taught me to braid. She thought about what it meant to leave them in that house for 3 more days, while the man who had poisoned their stepmother understood that the ground was giving way beneath him. She didn't like it. She didn't have a better option. That was the specific, grinding difficulty of a situation like this one. Not a shortage of courage, but a shortage of good choices, and having to pick from the ones that remained. 3 days, she said. Then we move. Rhett sent the wire to Helena that afternoon. He wrote the cover message in the careful, specific language of a man who has learned that official communications need to say exactly enough and no more. And he copied out the chemist's letter in full, word for word, and sent it as an attachment through the telegraph office, whose operator, a young man named Percy, who appeared to take his responsibilities with genuine seriousness, handled the transaction with the discretion of someone who understood he was part of something larger than a routine message. Victor Blackthorne, meanwhile, was doing what Evelyn had correctly identified he would do, moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, with the patience of a man who had never needed to hurry before and was not going to start now. He met with the commissioner. He had a long conversation at the saloon with 3 men whose names Rhett recognized and whose employment history suggested they weren't minors. He sent a letter to Bozeman, which Rhett learned about through the same postal routes that Victor used, because Percy the telegraph operator had a cousin who worked at the post office and had long since concluded that Victor Blackthorne was not someone he wanted ruling this town forever. The information that came back was not good. The letter to Bozeman was to Victor's legal team. 3 sentences requesting their immediate presence, which meant they could be in Blackstone Ridge within 5 days if they pushed. 5 days. Judge Harlan, if he came at all, would take 8. We're going to run out of time, Rhett said that evening. He said it the way he said difficult things, plainly, without dressing it in language that softened the shape of it. He was sitting across from Evelyn at Aldis's kitchen table, both of them with untouched coffee going cold. Harlan may come, but his lawyers will be here first, and the first thing they'll do is find a way to discredit every piece of evidence we have before it gets in front of a judge. The journal, Evelyn said. A dead woman's private writing, written during what they'll describe as a period of illness and mental instability. The chemist's letter. Victor will claim he ordered the compound for industrial use. The mining operation uses various chemical agents. He'll have someone ready to explain that. The letter alone without the vial might not be enough. The vial has residue in it. Residue that needs to be analyzed by someone qualified, which means sending it to a chemist or physician somewhere that isn't in Victor Blackthorn's pocket, which means time we don't have. Evelyn looked at the table. She looked at her coffee. She thought about the shape of what they had, the journal, the letter, the vial, Decker's testimony. And she thought about Victor's lawyers taking each one and working on it like a loose thread, pulling until the whole thing unraveled. Then we need more people, she said. Not official testimony, not legal documents, people who will stand up in this town and say what they know so that when his lawyers arrive, they don't walk into a room full of silence. They walk into a room where half of Blackstone Ridge has already made up its mind. Rhett looked at her. You want to go public. I want people to know what this man has done, she said. The servants at the estate, not just Mrs. Dodd. The doctor who signed off on Clara's death certificate. The people in this town who have been afraid of Victor for years and haven't had anywhere to put that fear. She met his eyes. He's been building a story about me for 3 days. I think it's time I started building my own. It was risky. She knew it was risky. Going public with an accusation against Victor Blackthorn before they had a judge in place was the kind of move that could go badly in ways she could enumerate clearly. He could use it to further establish a narrative of her instability. He could use it as grounds to accelerate whatever legal maneuvering his Bozeman lawyers were preparing. He could simply turn the town's opinion against her more effectively than she could turn it for her. These were real possibilities. But the alternative was waiting in Aldous Crane's spare room while the clock ran out. Who do you trust in this town? She asked Rhett. He thought. Not a short think, a real one. The kind where you actually measure the people you're considering rather than just listing names. Ben Kelsey, he said finally. He runs the biggest cattle operation in the valley. Victor's tried to acquire his water rights twice, and Ben's refused twice. He doesn't like Blackthorn, and he's not afraid of him, which puts him in a small category. He paused. Reverend, he stopped himself. The school teacher, Mrs. Aldridge. She's been in this town 15 years, and she taught Thomas Blackthorn his letters, and she told me once, quietly, that something about that household worried her. She didn't say more than that. She might say more now, Evelyn said. She might. He looked at her with the expression she was coming to know, reluctant, assessing, working out how much he could argue this down. I'll talk to Kelsey. You talk to Mrs. Aldridge. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't go near the main street if Victor's men are visible. I understand. Evelyn? He said her name in the particular way he'd been saying it for 2 days now. Not a warning, not a formality, but the word of someone who was trying to say something they didn't have another way to say. If this doesn't work, it has to work, she said. That's not a plan. No, she admitted, but it's what I have. Cha. Mrs. Aldridge was a small, precise woman of about 50 who ran the Blackstone Ridge schoolroom with the kind of organized authority that suggested she'd spent many years persuading people that learning was worth their time and had developed very effective methods for the purpose. She received Evelyn in her office at the back of the schoolroom, after hours, with the children gone and the building quiet, and she listened to everything Evelyn said without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for a long moment. Clara came to see me, she said, 4 months before she died. She sat in that chair, she nodded at the chair Evelyn was sitting in. And she told me she was having trouble sleeping and that she felt unwell. And she asked me in a roundabout way that I understood was roundabout because she was frightened, whether I thought there were people in town she could trust. She folded her hands on the desk. I told her I thought Aldous Crane was a good man. I told her Rhett Callahan was reliable. I did not ask her why she was asking because I was afraid of the answer, and I am not proud of that. The frankness of it, the simple, honest admission of a failure she'd been carrying for 4 months, caught Evelyn off guard in the best possible way. She didn't have the journal then, Evelyn said. She was still trying to understand what was happening to her. I know, Mrs. Aldridge looked at the desk. I should have asked anyway. What would it change now, Evelyn said carefully, if you said what you know? I know very little. She looked up. I know she came here frightened. I know Thomas Blackthorne is a child who started flinching at raised voices sometime in the past year. I noticed it in the schoolroom, and I noticed when it started. I know the first wife, Margaret, was described to me by women in this town who knew her as a healthy woman who declined very suddenly. She paused. None of that is evidence. No, Evelyn agreed, but it's testimony. And testimony from a woman who has been in this town 15 years and who taught these children carries a different weight than a journal or a letter. She held the older woman's gaze. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to say what you observed. Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, When does the judge arrive? If he comes, 9 days from now. I'll be there, she said. It was simple, undecorated, the statement of someone who had already done the internal accounting and arrived at an answer. I should have done more for Clara. I can do this for her now. Evelyn walked back through the cold to Aldous' house and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but the specific, steadying feeling of something shifting incrementally in the right direction. Small. Not enough on its own, but real. The moment Victor made his first direct move came on the evening of the second day, and it came not at Aldous Crane's house, but at Decker's property. Rhett got there 20 minutes after it happened because Decker had managed to get a boy on a fast horse to the sheriff's office with a message, and the message was 3 words. They came here. By the time Rhett arrived with Evelyn, she had insisted on coming, and he had not wasted time arguing. Decker was in his yard with a split lip and a look of controlled fury, and one of his barn walls had a new crack in it that hadn't been there that morning. 2 men, Decker said. His voice was flat and tight. I didn't know them. Not regular mining crew. They were different. They told me that my employment situation at the Kelsey Ranch was going to become precarious if I had any more conversations with the wrong people, and that certain water permits my property required could be delayed indefinitely if I continued in my current direction. Did they threaten you physically? Rhett asked, looking at the split lip. One of them made a point about how remote my property was, Decker said. I made a countervailing point with a fence post. The conversation became physical briefly, and then they decided to leave. He touched his lip, as though checking it was still there. I'm not backing down. I want to say that clearly. But I'm telling you that if they came to me, they've been to Mrs. Dodd too. Rhett looked at Evelyn. She was already thinking it. Mrs. Dodd won't have anyone to send a message, she said. She's inside the estate. I know. If he's turning the pressure up on witnesses, I know. He said again, more quietly. He was calculating something. She could see it in the way his eyes moved. Not panicked, but working fast, reassessing the timeline. He's escalating because he found the room. He knows what's missing. He knows we're building something. He looked at Decker. Can you stay somewhere other than here for a few nights? Decker glanced at his property. The house? The lean-to? The yard where his daughters played when the weather permitted. The look of a man measuring what he was willing to risk against what he was willing to lose. My daughters stay with my sister, he said. I'll manage here. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He met Rhett's eyes. I watched a good woman die, and I told myself a story about it for 7 months. I'm done telling that story. Whatever happens next, I'm done. Rhett gave him a brief, serious nod that was its own form of respect. If anything else happens, you get to town. Don't try to handle it yourself. Decker touched his split lip again. I had a fence post last time. And next time they might bring more than 2, Rhett said. On the ride back to town, Evelyn sat beside Rhett on the wagon seat and thought about the shape of what Victor was doing. He was not panicking. He was not running. He was applying pressure at the pressure points, the witnesses, the evidence, the people who might testify, with the methodical patience of someone who had spent years building and defending an empire and understood exactly where its walls were vulnerable. He's going to come after Mrs. Dodd, she said. Yes. And if she decides the risk is too great, she might? He said it without judgment. She has children. She has years of surviving in that house by keeping her head down. We can't hold her to a standard that doesn't account for what she's risking. I know. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. But if we lose her testimony and Victor's lawyers find a way to discredit the journal and the chemist's letter, we won't be left with nothing, Rhett said. Decker is solid. Mrs. Aldridge is solid. The vial is physical evidence that doesn't change its testimony based on pressure. He paused. And Harlan is coming. She looked at him. You heard back? This afternoon, while you were with Mrs. Aldridge. He said it without preamble, without building to it, which was the thing about Rhett Callahan she was finding herself relying on. He told you things straight, without the performance of delivery. He sent word he'll be here in 9 days. He's bringing a court recorder, and he's notified the Territory Attorney's Office. The Territory Attorney's Office. That was different from a circuit judge making a routine visit. That was the machinery of the law being assembled, and it was being assembled because Rhett had put the right words in the wire to Helena, and Harlan had read the chemist's letter and understood what he was reading. Victor's lawyers will still be here first, she said. 4 days first, yes. He kept his eyes on the road. Which means the next 4 days are going to be the worst of it. He's going to use everything he has before Harlan arrives and takes the situation out of his local control. Evelyn thought about that. She thought about 4 days, 100 hours, give or take, of Victor Blackthorne turning the full weight of his money and his lawyers and his decade of cultivated influence against everything they'd built. She thought about Mrs. Dodd inside the estate, knowing something and holding it, weighing the cost of saying it against the cost of staying silent. She thought about Thomas and Lily, taking their supper in the nursery, going to bed in rooms she'd been in, unaware that the ground beneath their whole world was in the process of giving way. The children, she said. Nora's brother. When does he arrive? Tomorrow evening, if the weather holds. She did the calculation. Tomorrow evening they could move the children. That left 4 days before the lawyers arrived, 9 before Harlan. If the children were out of the house before Victor's legal team landed, before he could use them as leverage or move them somewhere beyond reach. I need to get into the estate one more time, she said. Rhett turned to look at her. He had a look on his face that was somewhere between tired and something else, something that wasn't quite exasperation because it had too much understanding in it. No, he said, not for evidence. I need to talk to Thomas. Evelyn? He's 9 years old and he's going to be frightened when things start happening, she said. I don't want the first time he understands that someone is coming for him to be when a stranger shows up and tells him to get in a wagon. He needs to know before that. He needs to know someone is coming who he trusts. She paused. He trusted me. In the limited way a 9-year-old who doesn't trust anyone can trust someone. But it was something. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. The horse moved steadily through the cold. The road ahead was empty, the sky above it the particular dense black of a moonless winter night. There's a break in the kitchen fence on the south side, he said finally. It's been needing repair for 2 seasons. The cook uses it as a shortcut to the woodpile and nobody's bothered to fix it. If Mrs. Dodd's evening routine holds, I know her routine, Evelyn said. I'll be outside, he said, the whole time. If anything, if a door opens, if a light comes on that shouldn't, I come back immediately. You come back immediately, he confirmed. He looked at her. I want to say something. She waited. You've been doing this, he said slowly, like he was working it out as he spoke, since you walked into my office 3 nights ago, moving forward when there's something in front of you, not reckless. You keep saying the right things about being careful and meaning them, but you keep moving anyway. He paused. I want you to know that's not something I've seen very often. She didn't know what to do with that. Spoken plainly in the dark on a wagon seat with the cold coming off the mountain and 4 days of Victor Blackthorne's full resources between them and anything that looked like safety. It was too honest to dismiss and too complicated to respond to simply. Clara was braver than I am, she said finally. She was doing this alone in that house without a single person she could trust. She did it for months. She looked at the road. I'm just trying to finish what she started. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She went in the following evening through the broken fence on the south side, with the cold pressing down and Rhett a shadow at the fence line behind her. The kitchen was empty, Mrs. Dodd's supper hour, as reliable as a clock. She moved through the back hallway, the way she'd learned to move through this house, along the walls, without hurrying, with the specific kind of attention that meant she was tracking every sound simultaneously. The house had a particular quality at this hour. Not quiet exactly, but settled, like it was doing its best impression of an ordinary household. And the impression was only off by a small amount that you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it. The nursery was on the second floor, back corridor, third door on the left. She'd been there twice in the 11 days she'd spent here. She went up the servants' stairs, which she knew, and down the corridor she knew, and she knocked very lightly on the third door. Silence. Then the particular silence of someone on the other side of a door deciding whether to answer. Then Thomas's voice, low. "Who's there?" "Evelyn," she said, just as quietly. A pause that lasted long enough that she started to worry. Then the door opened. He looked at her with those careful eyes that she'd come to understand were his primary defense mechanism, looking carefully at things before deciding what they were. Behind him, Lily was sitting up in her bed, awake. "You left," he said. Not accusatory, factual. "I did," she said. "Can I come in for a moment?" He stepped back. She came in and crouched down to be at his level, which she'd found in the first days was the thing that made the most difference with Thomas. Not talking down to him, not performing warmth he hadn't earned, just being at the right height and speaking to him like someone who expected him to understand. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to be very brave about it, because it's going to sound frightening even though it's actually good." He looked at her steadily. Lily had come to the edge of her bed, wrapped in a blanket, watching. She told him, as plainly as she could manage, what was going to happen. Not the full shape of what Victor had done. That was not a conversation for this room, not tonight, not from her. But the part that affected them. That someone trustworthy was going to come in the next day with a wagon. That Thomas and Lily were going to go somewhere safe, with a family that would take care of them while things got sorted out. That it was going to be all right. "Is father in trouble?" Thomas asked. She held his gaze. A 9-year-old asking the question directly, with those careful eyes that had been measuring things for however long he'd been in this house. He deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said. He absorbed this. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Something in his face was doing several things at once. Fear, relief, guilt about the relief, and something underneath all of it that looked exhaustingly old for 9. "Lily doesn't know," he said quietly, "about the things I know. I understand. I've been—" He stopped. Started again. "There are things I heard, things I saw. I didn't know what to do with them." "I know," she said. "You're going to have the chance to tell them to someone whose job it is to listen. You don't have to carry them by yourself anymore." She paused. "Can you do this? Can you be ready when the wagon comes?" He looked at her for a long moment. 9 years old, wearing a flannel nightshirt, standing in the lamplight of a nursery in a house that had never been what a house should be, and still, somehow, despite everything that house had taught him about the world, managing to be something that Victor Blackthorne, with all his careful, deliberate work, had never fully extinguished in these children. "Yes," he said. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, quick, light. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said. "Your stepmother, Clara." She said the name because he wasn't allowed to, and someone should. She was trying to help you. She didn't stop trying until she couldn't anymore. Something crossed his face that she didn't have the right word for. He nodded, once, the same way Rhett nodded sometimes. A small, complete gesture that said more than the nod itself. She stood up. She looked at Lily, who had been listening with enormous eyes from the edge of her bed. "Will you come back?" Lily asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I promise." She meant it the way she'd meant the quiet promise she'd made to Clara in the dark of the spare room 3 nights ago. Not as a comfort she was offering without certainty, but as a thing she intended to make true regardless of what it cost her. She went back down the servants' stairs, through the back hallway, out through the kitchen, and across the frozen yard to the broken fence. Rhett was exactly where she'd left him, watching the house. And when she came through the gap, he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been standing in the cold, worried about another person, and is relieved but isn't going to make a production of it. "Well?" he said. "He'll be ready," she said. They walked back toward the road. The estate sat behind them, lit and ordinary-looking, still unaware of how much had shifted in the past 4 days. Victor Blackthorne, somewhere inside it or in the town, was doing his own calculations, moving his own pieces, counting on the fact that he had done this before and gotten away with it before, and understood better than anyone how the machinery of a frontier town's loyalties could be worked. What he didn't understand, what he'd never had to account for, because the women he'd brought into that house before had been there without anyone on the outside who knew to look, was that this time somebody had been paying attention from the beginning. This time, someone had been sent west to disappear and had decided instead to stay and fight. Harlan was 9 days out. The lawyers were 4 days out. And tomorrow, Nora's brother was arriving with a wagon and a set of instructions and the specific, quiet courage of an ordinary man doing the right thing in a situation that had nothing to do with him personally. 4 days. Everything depended on what happened in those 4 days, and what Victor Blackthorne did when he finally understood that the story he'd been carefully building had started falling apart at its edges, and that the woman he'd expected to replace her sister quietly and disappear had instead been doing something else entirely. They were about to find out which version of Victor Blackthorne appeared when everything he'd built began to come undone. Nora's brother arrived the following evening, as promised. His name was Cal Whitmore, and he was exactly the kind of man Nora had described, broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the face of someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions and didn't need situations explained to him twice. He drove a plain wagon with a canvas cover and 2 reliable horses, and he came into Blackstone Ridge from the South Road, which kept him off the main street, and he tied up behind the livery and walked to Aldis's back door like someone arriving for a quiet visit rather than the extraction of 2 children from a dangerous household. He sat at Aldis's kitchen table and drank coffee and listened to everything Rhett told him, and when Rhett finished, Cal said, "When do you need me to go?" "Tomorrow morning," Rhett said. "Early." "All right." That was the entirety of his questions. Victor's lawyers arrived the following afternoon, which gave them a window, narrow but real, and they used it. Rhett and Cal went to the estate at 7:30 in the morning, in the blue-gray light before the town fully woke. Rhett had worked out the approach carefully. He went to the front door as himself, as the acting sheriff of Blackstone Ridge, with a deputy's badge and a legal authority that Victor could challenge but couldn't immediately override, and he told the man who answered the door that he needed to speak with Mrs. Dodd on a matter related to an ongoing investigation. Mrs. Dodd came to his door inside 4 minutes, which told Evelyn, waiting with Cal in the wagon at the far end of the estate road, that Mrs. Dodd had been waiting for something like this to happen and had already decided what she would do. The children came out wrapped in coats and carrying 1 bag each, which told Evelyn something else. Thomas had been ready since the night before. He had packed Lily's bag as well as his own, and he had packed practically. Warm clothes, a few small things that mattered, nothing unnecessary. 9 years old, doing the work of someone twice that age, because that house had required it of him. Lily came out holding Thomas's hand and saw Evelyn standing beside the wagon. She crossed the distance between them without any of the usual hesitation of a child in an unfamiliar situation and put her arms around Evelyn's waist and held on with the fierce, uncomplicated grip of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has finally found something that feels safer than where they were. Evelyn held her. She didn't say anything. Sometimes there isn't anything to say. Thomas stood a little apart, watching the house the way you watch something you're not sure you'll ever see again and aren't sure how you feel about that. Then he looked at Evelyn with those careful eyes, and she gave him a small nod, and he climbed into the wagon. They were moving within 6 minutes of arriving. Cal drove south at a steady pace, not hurrying because hurrying drew attention. Evelyn watched the wagon until it turned the bend in the road and disappeared into the tree line, and then she turned back toward town. Victor's lawyers were named Croft and Alderman, and they were exactly what 3 days of anticipation had prepared Evelyn to expect. Precise, expensively dressed for the territory, carrying leather satchels that contained what she imagined were enough legal mechanisms to complicate any proceeding significantly. They set themselves up at the saloon, the best available accommodation in Blackstone Ridge, which was still barely adequate by their apparent standards, and they sent word to the sheriff's office within an hour of arriving that they required a meeting. Rhett came back from that meeting looking like a man who has spent an hour listening to polished language used to say things that had no polish in them at all. "They filed a motion for the return of property," he said. "The journal, the chemist's letter, and what they're calling a glass container removed without permission from Mr. Blackthorne's private residence." He sat down. They've also filed a motion contesting the jurisdiction of Judge Harlan's visit, on the basis that no crime has been formally charged, and therefore there's no basis for a territorial court proceeding. Can they do that? Evelyn asked. They can file anything, Aldous said from his armchair. His broken leg appeared to be causing him sustained indignation. Filing it and having it succeed are separate matters. Harlan has jurisdiction on territorial criminal matters, regardless of whether a formal charge has been laid. The investigation itself gives him standing to hear preliminary evidence. He paused. But Croft knows that. He's not filing that motion to win it. He's filing it to create noise, to make everything look disputed and contested so that by the time Harlan arrives, there's a blizzard of legal paper covering the actual issue. The actual issue being that his client poisoned 2 women, Evelyn said. Yes, Aldous said. That. Rhett leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at the floor in the manner of someone doing arithmetic. They asked about the children, he said. The room went quiet. Victor wants them returned to the estate, Rhett said. They're making noises about parental rights, about the wrongful removal of minor children from their legal guardian's household. He's their legal guardian, Evelyn said. The word sat badly. He is. Right now, legally, he is. Rhett looked up. Which is why we needed them gone before the lawyers arrived, and why Cal needed to be someone with no legal connection to this situation. As far as the record shows, the children left the estate on their own initiative this morning. There's no documentation of anyone assisting them because there isn't any. He paused. Croft can make noise about it, but he can't prove anything, and he can't compel a 9-year-old to disclose where he went. Thomas won't say anything, Evelyn said with more certainty than she'd have felt about most adults. No, Rhett agreed. I don't think he will. The next part of the problem settled on the room the way the next part of a problem always does when you've solved the previous one. Immediately, with no grace period. They had 5 days until Harlan arrived. They had Croft and Alderman in town, generating legal noise and talking to anyone who might be persuaded that the official version of events was the one Victor had been circulating since the beginning. They had a commissioner who was still nominally on Victor's side. They had a vial of residue that needed chemical analysis by someone qualified, which was a problem they had been deferring because there was no qualified chemist within easy reach of Blackstone Ridge. The assay office in Butte, Rhett said, they have a man who does chemical analysis for the mining operations. He's not a forensic examiner, but he knows compounds, and he'll recognize arsenic residue. Butte is 2 days each direction, Evelyn said. I know. You can't go. If you leave now, Croft has 5 days in this town without the only law officer who isn't connected to Victor, and I know, he said again. He looked at her. It doesn't have to be me. She thought about it. The vial in its current location, wrapped carefully in cloth, in a box under the floorboards of Aldis's bedroom, which Aldis had suggested with the comfortable practicality of a man who had been hiding things under floorboards for decades. She thought about the road to Butte. 2 days in winter cold, alone. I'll go, she said. You'll go to Butte, Rhett said, and the flatness of his tone suggested he was not going to pretend this was a development he was comfortable with. The lawyers don't know what I look like yet, she said. They arrived after I was already staying here. Victor has described me to them, but a description from a man whose interest in my appearance is not exactly neutral. I look like any other woman traveling for ordinary reasons. She paused. And in Butte, nobody knows who I am at all. If Victor realizes you've left town, he won't, she said. He's watching this house. He's watching the sheriff's office. He's not watching the South Road because, as far as he knows, everything he needs to worry about is here. She looked at Rhett. It's the right move. He knew it was the right move. She could see it in the way he wasn't arguing, which was the specific quality of Rhett Callahan's reluctance when he'd already concluded something. He didn't dress up his disagreement with extra objections when the logic had run out. He just went quiet and accepted it, and then immediately started thinking about how to make it safer. Ben Kelsey's man, he said. He runs supply between here and Butte twice a month. He's going in 2 days' time anyway, and he's solid. You go with him, you're just another passenger, nothing unusual. Agreed. You're back in 4 days. Which gives us 1 day before Harlan. 1 day is enough, he said, though his expression suggested he was not entirely sure of this, and was saying it anyway because the alternative was not having it be enough. But the 2 days before she left were the worst of waiting, which is the specific torture of a situation where you have done what you can for the moment and are now required to stand still while other people do things you can't control. Victor's lawyers went to work on the town with the systematic efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before and understood that local opinion, properly shaped, could be as useful as legal precedent. They met with the commissioner again. They had a long conversation at the saloon with 3 of the more prosperous business owners in town, which Evelyn learned about through the network of information that had assembled itself organically in the past week. Percy at the telegraph office, the livery owner's wife, Mrs. Aldridge, who turned out to have ears in more corners of Blackstone Ridge than anyone had given her credit for. What the lawyers were saying in these conversations was a refined version of what Victor had been saying since the beginning, but refined the way a raw ore gets refined, processed into something that looked more like legitimate concern and less like the self-interested fabrication it actually was. They were suggesting, with great politeness and apparent regret, that the evidence being cited against their client was circumstantial at best and manufactured at worst. They were suggesting that the young woman at the center of the accusation was grieving and confused and had been manipulated by a deputy whose ambitions in this county were perhaps larger than his current position warranted. That last part was designed specifically for Rhett, and Evelyn felt a clean anger when she heard it. "They're trying to make it about you," she told him. "I know," he said. He didn't seem particularly disturbed by this, which was either genuine equanimity or the very good impression of it. "Let them. Harlan knows me. I've testified in front of him twice. He's not going to discount my evidence on the basis of a character suggestion from 2 men who arrived in this town 4 days ago. The commissioner might." "The commissioner's opinion of me stopped mattering when Harlan agreed to come," Rhett said. "The commissioner doesn't run a territorial proceeding. Harlan does." This was logical. It was also the kind of logic that worked in clean conditions and could be disrupted by the numerous things that were not clean about these conditions. Victor himself had gone quiet in a way that bothered Evelyn more than his earlier activity had. He was visible occasionally on the main street speaking with Croft and Alderman, but the public campaign he'd been running in the first days, the concerned appearances, the conversations with shopkeepers, the performance of a worried man seeking his missing betrothed, had subsided. He had retreated into the estate and was doing whatever he was doing behind those walls, and the absence of visible movement was not reassuring. It was the quiet of someone who had shifted from public maneuvering to private planning, and private planning was harder to track. "He's going to try something before Harlan gets here," Aldous said on the evening before Evelyn was due to leave. He said it without drama, as plain observation. A man like that, watching what he's built start to go. He won't just wait for a judge. "What does he have left to try?" Evelyn asked. "The evidence itself," Aldous said. "If he can't recover it through legal means, he may try other means. And the witnesses." He looked at Rhett. "Decker needs more than a fence post." Rhett had arranged for Ben Kelsey to send 2 of his ranch hands to stay at Decker's property for the remainder of the week. Large, reliable men who had no particular connection to Victor and no reason to be intimidated by him. Decker had accepted this with the expression of a man who had already had his fence post moment and was grateful for reinforcement without being willing to say so directly. Mrs. Dodd had not been heard from since the morning the children left. The estate had closed around her again, its ordinary-looking surface restored, nothing visible from outside to suggest anything unusual was happening within. Evelyn thought about her every day, about the decision she'd made at the kitchen door, 7 words, and what it was costing her to continue existing inside that house while the world outside it shifted. She left for Butte on a cold, clear morning, tucked into the supply wagon beside a taciturn man named Wade, who asked her 0 questions about her destination or purpose, and spent most of the 2-day journey either driving in silence or sleeping at the way stations with the reliable unconsciousness of someone who had learned to sleep whenever sleep was available. The vial was in her satchel, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth and nested in a tin box she'd borrowed from Nora's kitchen. She kept the satchel on her lap for the entire journey. The assay office in Butte was a plain building run by a man named Greaves, who had the distracted, slightly ink-stained quality of someone who spent most of his time in the company of chemical compounds rather than people. He received her with the mild, professional attention of someone accustomed to unusual requests from the mining territory. She told him she needed the residue in the vial analyzed and identified, and she told him why she needed it quickly. He looked at her. He looked at the vial. He looked at her again. "This is for a court proceeding," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." He held the vial up to the light in the window, which was what Rhett had done when he'd first seen it, and Evelyn found herself thinking that this was what evidence looked like in the hands of people doing their jobs. Not dramatic, not certain, just a careful, serious act of looking. "I can have it analyzed by morning," Greaves said, "and I can put my findings in writing on official assay office letterhead, which carries evidentiary weight in territorial proceedings." "That's exactly what I need," she said. "If what you're describing is in this vial," he said carefully, "you understand that my findings are what they are. I don't adjust results." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on that." He worked through the night. She slept at the boarding house across the street, or tried to. She mostly lay in the dark going over the sequence of what came next, looking for the places where it could fail, trying to think past them. There were more of those places than she liked. A judge could be swayed by the blizzard of legal paper Croft had generated. A witness could back down under renewed pressure. The commissioner could file some procedural objection that delayed the proceedings long enough for Victor's lawyers to find another angle. She thought about Clara, who had done all of this alone, who had had no Rhett Callahan, no Aldous Crane, no Mrs. Aldridge with 15 years of standing in a community behind her. Clara had been alone in that house with a journal and a false-backed cabinet and a vial of tea she'd stopped drinking, trying to build a case with no tools and no allies and no way out. "Let whoever finds this know that I didn't get sick. I was made sick." Greaves handed her the written findings at 7 in the morning. Evelyn read the document standing in his office doorway, the cold coming in from the street behind her. The language was technical, precise, the language of a man who worked with chemical compounds and understood their properties, and it said in terms that required no interpretation. The residue in the vial was consistent with a specific arsenic compound, chronic exposure to which would produce symptoms including nausea, fatigue, and respiratory distress, with a slow progression that would present clinically as a respiratory fever. She folded the document and put it in her coat next to the journal and the chemist's letter and Clara's handkerchief. She was back in Blackstone Ridge by the following evening, one day before Judge Harlan was due to arrive. She knew something had happened before Wade had stopped the wagon, because the quality of the main street was wrong. There were more people than usual for the early evening. Not a crowd, but a gathering, the kind that forms when something has occurred and people have come out to understand what it is. Rhett met her at the livery with the expression of a man managing multiple pieces of a difficult situation and had one more to add. "Mrs. Dodd," he said. "She came to the sheriff's office this afternoon." Evelyn went still. "Is she all right?" "Yes. She's here." He moved, and she understood she was meant to follow. Victor tried to dismiss her this morning. He told her she was no longer needed, which is the kind of dismissal that comes with the understanding that she should leave quietly and quickly and not speak to anyone on her way out. He looked at Evelyn briefly as they walked. She didn't. The woman sitting in the chair across from Aldous' desk was the same Mrs. Dodd Evelyn knew. The same gray dress, the same practiced composure, and also different in the specific way that a person looks different when they have made a decision that has cost them something and are still standing upright. She looked older somehow, and also less guarded, as though the guard had been the expensive part and she'd decided she could no longer afford it. She looked at Evelyn when she came in, and something in her expression relaxed by a fraction. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Evelyn said. "Yes." Mrs. Dodd looked at her hands, folded in her lap. He found that the room had been accessed. He didn't say it outright. He never says things outright. That's not how he operates. But his manner changed 3 days ago, became careful in a different way than usual. And this morning he called me in and told me my services were no longer required and that I should be packed and gone before noon. She paused. He gave me a month's wages in cash, which told me he wanted me gone quickly enough that it was worth paying for. He thought you might talk, Rhett said. He was right, she said simply. I've been deciding whether to talk for 7 months. He made the decision easier. She looked at Evelyn. Clara came to me the week before she died. She was frightened and she wasn't well and she had figured out what was being done to her. She asked me if I would help her, if I would find someone who could help. Her voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a woman recounting something she had gone over many times in the accounting of her own failures. I told her I had children. I told her I was sorry. She didn't argue with me. She just nodded and went back to her room. The room was very quiet. 3 days later, she was worse, Mrs. Dodd said. A week after that, she was dead. And I told myself I couldn't have done anything, that it was too late, that I hadn't known for certain, that there was nothing I could have done that would have made a difference. She stopped. I've been telling myself that story for 7 months. I'm done telling it. She had seen things over 12 years in that household that she had filed away without allowing herself to name. The first wife, Margaret, declining over a period of 8 months with symptoms that the county doctor had called a lung condition. Victor's particular attention to his wife's evening routines, what's the tea, the small personal gestures that seemed like care and that she now understood differently. A visit from the Bozeman chemist 2 years before Margaret's death, a delivery of something small and glass-stoppered that Victor had taken personally and she had not seen again. I never saw him administer anything, she said. I need to be clear about that, but I watched him. I watched the pattern of it, and I know what I observed, and I'll say it in front of anyone who needs to hear it. You'll testify, Rhett said. Yes, she said, whatever that costs me. Evelyn thought about the document in her coat pocket, from Greaves at the Butte Assay office. She thought about Clara's journal and the chemist's letter and Decker's account of the vial he'd seen. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge, who would be there. She thought about Thomas Blackthorne, 9 years old and somewhere south of here with Nora's brother, carrying things he'd seen and heard that no 9-year-old should have to carry. They had enough. She believed, sitting in that room with Aldis's fire and the assembled weight of everything they'd built in 9 days, that they had enough. Not certainty. The law did not deal in certainty, especially not in a frontier territory where a man with money and lawyers could complicate any proceeding, but enough. Harlan arrives tomorrow, Rhett said. He looked at Evelyn. How'd Greaves go? She took the document from her coat and handed it to him. He read it, and she watched his face, and something in his expression shifted in the way things shift when you've been holding tension for a long time and a piece of it releases. Arsenic compound, he said. Consistent with what would produce Clara's symptoms, she said. He put it in writing on official letterhead. Rhett set the document on Aldis's desk, next to the chemist's letter, next to the journal, next to the written account Decker had provided. He looked at the assembled evidence for a moment, the physical shape of 9 days of work, of everything that Clara had tried to build before she ran out of time. It's enough, Aldis said from his chair, with the authority of a man who had sat in enough courtrooms to know the difference between enough and not enough. Judge Harlan arrived at noon the following day, on horseback with 2 men from the territory attorney's office, and he came directly to the sheriff's office without stopping at the saloon or the mercantile or any of the places where Croft and Alderman had spent 9 days building architecture. He was a tall man, gray-haired, with the particular look of someone who had been making difficult decisions for long enough that difficulty had become a kind of climate they simply lived in rather than weather they experienced. He shook hands with Rhett and with Aldis, and he looked at the assembled documents on the desk, and he looked at Evelyn with the assessing attention of someone who needed to understand what kind of person he was dealing with before he made any decisions. Miss Hartwell, he said, you've had a complicated few weeks. Yes, she said. You came to this territory to marry a man your family arranged for you. Yes. And instead you ended up building a criminal case against him. My sister built most of it, Evelyn said. I finished it. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the journal, which was open to Clara's last entry. He read those 3 words. He found it. And she watched his face and saw the moment they landed. I've received Croft and Alderman's filings, he said. I've read them. I've also read everything Deputy Callahan sent to Helena. He looked at Rhett. You said the vial has been analyzed. By the assay office in Butte, Rhett said. The written findings are there. Harlan picked up Greaves's document and read it carefully, the way he read everything, thoroughly, without rushing, giving it the attention that a document saying what this one said deserved. He set it down. He looked at the window. He looked back at Rhett. "The proceedings will begin tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll hear the filings from both sides first, and then I'll hear testimony." He paused. "I want you to understand, Miss Hartwell. The proceedings are formal. What happens in that room is what the evidence supports. Nothing more." "I understand," she said. "Whatever you hoped for coming into this territory, I hoped to find out what happened to my sister," she said. "That's all I hoped for." He looked at her for a moment, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy something. He gave a brief nod and turned back to Rhett, and they began discussing the procedural details, and Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about tomorrow. Victor Blackthorne had been untouchable in Blackstone Ridge for a decade. He had money and lawyers and a commissioner and a county doctor and years of cultivated influence in every direction. He had 2 wives in the ground and a town that had learned to be careful around him, and a story he'd been telling about Evelyn since the moment she left his estate. But he did not have the chemist's letter, which named him. He did not have the vial, which held what it held. He did not have Clara's journal, which was her voice speaking clearly from the other side of 7 months of silence. He did not have Decker's testimony, or Mrs. Dodd's testimony, or Mrs. Aldridge sitting in that schoolroom with 15 years of careful observation. He did not have Thomas, who was somewhere safe and who knew things that a 9-year-old should never have had to know, and who was, when the time came, going to tell the truth. And he did not have, Evelyn understood with a clarity that settled over her like the first cold air after a long time indoors, the thing he had counted on from the beginning, the silence of a woman who had come a long way and had no one on the outside looking for her. She was here. She had been looking from the first moment. And tomorrow, in a formal proceeding in front of a territorial judge, the town of Blackstone Ridge was finally going to have to decide what it had actually witnessed all these years and what it was going to do about it. She pressed her hand flat against her coat pocket, where the handkerchief with its small embroidered C had been since the first night. "I'm still here," she said to Clara silently, the way she'd been saying it every day for 9 days. "I'm still here. One more day." The morning of the proceeding arrived gray and cold, the kind of February sky that sits low over mountain country and doesn't move all day. Evelyn was awake before the light came, sitting at the small desk in Nora's spare room with the documents laid out in front of her. The journal, the chemist's letter, Greaves's findings from Butte. Not reading them, because she had read them enough times that the words were already part of her, but simply looking at them. The physical fact of them, the weight of what they represented. She had been in Blackstone Ridge for 26 days. It felt simultaneously like a very long time and not long at all. Not long enough, certainly, to feel prepared for what was about to happen in the single large room above the mercantile that served as Blackstone Ridge's closest approximation of a courtroom. But ready and prepared were different things, and she had given up waiting to feel prepared sometime around day 12. She dressed carefully. Not to impress, she had no illusions about what this proceeding was and what it wasn't, but because the way you carried yourself in a room where your credibility was going to be questioned mattered in the same way that small, deliberate things always matter. She put Clara's handkerchief in her coat pocket. Rhett knocked at 7:30. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much but had decided not to make an issue of it. "How are you?" he asked. "Ask me tonight," she said. He accepted that without pushing. They walked together to the building and climbed the stairs and entered the room where everything that had been building for 26 days was finally going to come to a head. The room filled quickly. Blackstone Ridge was not a large town, but it turned out almost entirely. They came in and found seats on the long wooden benches. The mercantile owner and his wife, the livery owner, Percy from the telegraph office, several of the mining crew, women Evelyn had passed on the main street and never spoken to, people she didn't recognize at all who had come from properties she'd never been to. Ben Kelsey was there, broad and steady in the back row with 2 of his ranch hands, Mrs. Aldridge sat near the front with the composed attention of someone who intended to be called on and was ready. Croft and Alderman sat at a table to the left, their leather satchels open, their papers organized with the neat precision of men who did this for a living. Victor Blackthorne sat between them, and this was the thing Evelyn had steeled herself for without entirely succeeding. Seeing him in this room with this context, after 26 days of understanding what he was. He looked, as he always looked, controlled. The silver at his temples and the good coat and the practiced ease of movement. But something had changed in the past 10 days, something around the eyes that you'd miss if you didn't know him, which most people in this room didn't. A tightness. The specific expression of a man who has spent years in a room where he controlled everything and is now sitting in one where he doesn't, and is working very hard not to show how much that costs him. He looked at Evelyn when she came in. She looked back. She held it for a moment, then looked away first, not because she was backing down, but because she was done giving him her attention without getting something useful from it. Judge Harlan called the room to order at 8 o'clock exactly. Croft went first, because Harlan gave both sides opening statements and Croft had filed more paperwork, and appeared to believe that paperwork was its own form of momentum. He was a composed, professional speaker who said a great deal in careful language that amounted, stripped of its surface, to 3 arguments. That Evelyn Hartwell had removed property from a private residence without authorization, that the evidence being presented had been obtained through irregular means and should be considered accordingly, and that Victor Blackthorne was a man of demonstrated standing in this community who had done nothing more than grieve his wife and attempt to provide for his household. He said all of this without raising his voice or making any statement that could be technically characterized as a lie, which was, Evelyn had come to understand the specific skill that made men like Croft expensive. Rhett presented the response with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance, no elevated language, just the facts in the order that made them most comprehensible. The vial obtained from the private study, the chemist's letter naming Victor Blackthorne, and the compound ordered. Greaves's findings from Butte, which Harlan had already read, but which Rhett walked through carefully for the room. Clara's journal, which he did not read aloud in full but quoted from specifically, the passages that mattered, in Clara's own words. When he read the last entry, 3 words, he found it. The room was very quiet. Victor Blackthorne's expression did not change, but Croft touched his arm once, briefly, which told Evelyn that Victor's control was costing more than it appeared. Decker testified first. He sat in the chair that had been placed facing the room, and he told what he'd seen in the kitchen, the vial, the drops measured into the cup, the certainty he'd talked himself out of for 7 months. He was not a polished witness. He said, more than was ideal, and he had to backtrack once to correct a detail about the timing, and his hands on his knees were not entirely still. But he was telling the truth, and it came across the way truth does when a person has been carrying it long enough that they're relieved to put it down, with a weight to it that performance doesn't have. Croft cross-examined him with the practiced skill of someone who knew exactly which loose threads to pull. The distance from which Decker had observed, the lighting in the kitchen at that hour, whether Decker had any personal grievance against Victor Blackthorne that might color his account. Decker answered each question with the stubborn patience of a man who had made up his mind and wasn't going to be argued out of it. "You didn't report this at the time," Croft said. "No," Decker said. "Why not?" Decker looked at him. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Same reason most people in this town haven't said anything for 10 years. That man," he did not gesture, did not raise his voice, "owns the water rights for 3 properties on this side of the valley, and he has lawyers in 3 counties and a commissioner who hunts with him. I was afraid. I'm not proud of it. But I'm saying it now." The room made a sound, Chassesson, not a murmur, not a gasp, something quieter than those, the sound of recognition. Mrs. Dodd testified next. She sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and she said what she'd seen in 12 years, carefully and completely, without embellishment and without softening. She described Margaret's decline. She described Victor's particular attention to the evening tea routine with both wives. She described Clara coming to her a week before she died, frightened and sick, asking for help. And she described what she'd said in response. And she said it the same way she'd said it to Evelyn in Aldous' kitchen, plainly, without excusing herself. "I told her I couldn't help her," she said. "That was wrong. I have to live with it." She paused. "I can't undo it. I can tell what I know now, and I can do that, so I'm doing it." The room was very still. Croft was more careful with Mrs. Dodd than he'd been with Decker. He understood she was a more damaging witness, and he approached her with the specific caution of someone diffusing something they're not certain about. He questioned the reliability of 12-year-old observations. He questioned whether declining health could have various explanations. He was not rude. He was relentlessly professionally skeptical. Mrs. Dodd answered every question with the same even voice. She did not become uncertain. She had arrived at this moment after 7 months of deciding, and there was nothing left in her to be shaken by a man with a leather satchel. Mrs. Aldridge testified to Thomas's changed behavior in the schoolroom, the flinching, the particular silence when certain subjects arose, the timeline of when it began. She testified to Clara visiting her 4 months before her death, frightened and roundabout, and what she'd said in response, and what she wished she'd said. She was precise and credible and had the quiet authority of 15 years in a community behind every word. Then Harlan asked Evelyn whether she wished to speak. She had thought about this carefully. She was not a neutral witness. She was Clara's sister. She was the woman who had taken the journal and the chemist's letter from the estate. She was the person around whom Victor's narrative of instability had been constructed. Croft would use every one of those facts. She knew it going in. She sat down in the chair facing the room and she looked at the people on the benches. At Mrs. Aldridge, at Decker, at Ben Kelsey in the back row, at Percy from the telegraph office, at all the people who had spent years in this town learning to be careful and were now sitting in a room deciding whether to stop. And she said what she knew. She said it simply. She didn't perform emotion because she didn't need to. The facts, told plainly, were their own kind of weight. She talked about the lock on the outside of her bedroom door. She talked about the dinner where Clara's name was not mentioned. She talked about finding the handkerchief in the desk drawer and knowing, with the certainty of someone who had known another person their whole life, that Clara had been in that room. She talked about the journal and what was in it, and she read the last entry herself, aloud, in her own voice. He found it, because she thought it mattered that Clara's words came from someone who loved her rather than from a legal proceeding. She talked about the tea she'd been drinking before she understood what it was. She said, "My sister came to this town in good faith. She was 26 years old, and she came because her family arranged for her to come, and she tried to do what she'd been sent to do, and when she understood what was happening to her, she tried to stop it. She tried to find proof. She tried to protect 2 children who were not even her own. She did all of this alone without a single person who could help her, and she ran out of time." She paused. "I came here because my family sent me, same as Clara. I stayed because what happened to her was wrong, and because someone needed to say so in a room where it would count." Croft cross-examined her for 25 minutes. He was thorough, and he was skilled, and he landed some points. The irregular manner in which the evidence had been obtained, her relationship to the situation, the fact that she had no legal authority to remove anything from the estate. She answered each question honestly, including the ones that were uncomfortable, because she had decided before she sat down that the only way through this was the truth told completely, even the parts of it that worked against her. When he asked whether she believed she had been objective in her assessment of Victor Blackthorne, given her personal circumstances, she said, "No. I believe from early on that he had killed my sister. I want the court to know that. I also want the court to know that I brought you physical evidence analyzed by an independent chemist, testimony from multiple witnesses with no connection to each other, and a written record in my sister's own hand, because I understood that what I believed was not sufficient. Evidence is what matters. So I went and found it." Croft had nothing to add to that. Victor Blackthorne's lawyers put him on the stand, which was a strategic decision that told Evelyn they were worried. A confident defense doesn't need its client to speak. A defense that puts its client in front of a judge is a defense that has calculated that the client, performed correctly, is more persuasive than the alternative. Victor performed well. He was measured and sorrowful and articulate, and he told the story he'd been telling for weeks. Clara's declining health, his concern, his grief, his bewilderment at finding himself accused by a woman who had arrived in his household in distress and constructed a narrative from her own pain. He was convincing. She could see it landing on some faces in the room, the slight softening, the moment of doubt. But Rhett had been given the opportunity to cross-examine, and Rhett had spent 26 days preparing for exactly this conversation. He asked Victor about the chemist's letter. Victor said the compound had been ordered for industrial use at the mine. Rhett asked which mine and which specific application, and which foreman had requested it. Victor's answers became less specific by degrees, the way answers do when they're being constructed rather than recalled. Rhett asked about the Butte Assay Office's findings. Victor said the vial had been taken from his private property without authorization, and he questioned the chain of custody. Rhett acknowledged this calmly and then pointed out that the findings were consistent with the compound named in the letter addressed to Victor Blackthorne personally, and asked whether Victor could explain that consistency. Victor said it was coincidence. The room made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite a murmur. Rhett asked about Margaret. Victor said Margaret had died of a natural illness, which was what the county doctor had certified. Rhett asked when Victor had last seen the county doctor. Victor said he didn't see what that had to do with anything. Rhett said he thought it was relevant, given that the doctor's certification was being offered as evidence and the doctor himself was not present to testify, and asked Harlan to note the absence for the record. Harlan noted it, and then Rhett asked very quietly, without any change in his tone, "Mr. Blackthorne, did you bring your late wife Clara her evening tea on the night of January 7th of this year?" A pause. "I may have," Victor said. "It was my habit to care for my wife's comfort. And on the night of January 3rd? I don't recall. The journal your late wife kept, which has been entered into this proceeding, describes you bringing her tea on the evenings of January 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. She also describes stopping drinking it. She also describes on January 14th feeling significantly worse. She died on January 23rd. Rhett looked at him steadily. "Would you like to explain the connection between those dates?" Victor looked at his lawyers. Croft made a small gesture, barely visible, the gesture of a man saying, "Hold your position." Victor looked back at Rhett. "My wife was ill," he said. "I cared for her. The journal of a sick woman is not a reliable account of events. Your first wife, Margaret, also declined over a period of months with similar symptoms," Rhett said. "Were you also in the habit of bringing Margaret her evening tea?" A longer pause this time, long enough that the pause itself was an answer. "I cared for my wife," Victor said. "Which wife?" Rhett asked. The room went completely still. "Tut." Harlan deliberated for 4 hours, which was not unusual for a proceeding of this complexity, and which Evelyn spent mostly in Aldous' kitchen, sitting with Nora and Mrs. Dodd and saying very little. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could be done had been done. The rest was Harlan's. She thought about the nature of waiting, about how it was always the worst part, not because the outcome was uncertain, though it was, but because waiting required you to stop doing anything and simply exist in the space between what you'd built and what would happen to it. She had been moving for 26 days. Stopping felt almost physical, like putting down something very heavy. Nora made coffee. Mrs. Dodd held her cup in both hands and looked at the table. Aldous dozed in his armchair, or appeared to, though Evelyn suspected he was not actually asleep. Rhett came in after 2 hours, sat down, and did not speak for a long time. "Whatever happens," he said finally, not looking at anyone in particular, "what you built in there, that doesn't disappear regardless of the outcome. The town saw it, they heard it, that's not nothing." "No," Evelyn agreed, "it's not nothing." He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that had nothing to do with the proceeding, something quieter and more complicated that had been building for 26 days in the specific way that things build when people go through something difficult together and come out the other side changed by the going through. She didn't know yet what to do with it. She thought she probably didn't need to know today. The word came at 4:30. Harlan's verdict was not dramatic in its delivery. He read it from his notes in the measured language of a territorial court, and what it said was this: that the evidence presented constituted sufficient grounds for formal criminal charges against Victor Blackthorne on 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count pertaining to Clara Hartwell Blackthorne and 1 pertaining to Margaret Elise Blackthorne, that he would be held pending transfer to the territorial prison facility in Helena to await trial, that the motion for return of property was denied. Victor Blackthorne, upon hearing this, said nothing. He sat very still for a moment, the practiced stillness of a man managing something that threatened to be unmanageable. And then he stood when the territorial men came for him, and he allowed himself to be led from the room, and he did not look at Evelyn. She did not look away. The room let out a collective breath that it had been holding for varying lengths of time. Some people for the past hour, some for considerably longer. She heard several people crying, which she had not expected, and which undid something in her chest that she hadn't known was still held tight. Ben Kelsey, in the back row, exhaled, and stared at the ceiling. Mrs. Aldridge sat with her hands pressed flat on her knees and her eyes closed. Rhett beside Evelyn said nothing. He looked at the space where Victor had been, and then he looked at her, and she looked back. And they sat in the quiet aftermath of something that had required everything they had and let it be quiet for a moment. The weeks that followed were administrative in the way that aftermath always is. Unglamorous, slow, full of paperwork and decisions, and logistical problems that didn't have the urgency of crisis to make them feel important. The mining operation passed into receivership pending legal resolution. The county commissioner resigned under pressure, which was the most efficient way for the situation to resolve itself and also the most cowardly. But Evelyn had run out of appetite for fighting every battle simultaneously. The county doctor quietly declined to renew his practice in Blackstone Ridge, which told its own story without requiring anyone to name it. Nora's brother Cal brought Thomas and Lily back 3 weeks after the verdict. Evelyn was at Aldis's house when the wagon came down the road, and she went out to meet it, and Lily came off the wagon the same way she'd said goodbye in the cold that morning. Directly, without hesitation, putting her arms around Evelyn's waist and holding on. Thomas climbed down after her. He had the expression of a child who had been somewhere safe and was returning to somewhere complicated and was trying to work out how to hold both things at once. He looked at the town around him, the main street, the buildings, the ridge, and the estate visible on the rise. And then he looked at Evelyn. "Is it over?" he asked. She thought about what to say. She thought about the honesty she'd owed him from the first morning in that hallway, when he'd been 9 years old with his back against the wall, and she'd decided to talk to him straight rather than down. "The worst of it," she said, "there's still the trial, which will take time. And there are things that happen that don't just stop because of a verdict. But he's gone. He can't hurt anyone here anymore." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at the estate on the ridge, distant, windows dark. "I don't want to go back there," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "Ever." "Where do we go?" She had been working this out for 3 weeks, with Aldis and Nora and Rhett, with a lawyer from Helena who handled the guardianship paperwork, with the particular grinding patience of someone building something practical rather than dramatic. The estate and its assets would eventually be adjudicated. The children's welfare required a decision that didn't wait for that. "There's a ranch," she said, "about 15 miles east in a valley past the second ridge. I've been looking at it." She paused. "It needs work. A lot of work. The house is sound, but it's small and the fences want fixing. And the whole south pasture needs attention." She looked at him. "But it's clean. Nobody's history is in it." Thomas looked at her. Something in his careful eyes shifting, the calculation that had been his primary defense mechanism working through this new information and arriving at something. "Will you be there?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Lily looked up from where her face was still pressed against Evelyn's coat. "What about the man?" she said. "The one with the badge." Evelyn felt her face do something she couldn't entirely control. "His name is Rhett," she said. "You can ask him yourself." "But..." She asked Rhett that evening. Not in those terms. Lily had asked a child's version of a question that adults generally require more words to approach. But the question was the same at its root, and Evelyn asked it standing in Aldis's yard in the February cold with the last of the day's light going out over the ridge, which was as good a place as any for a conversation she'd been putting off for 3 weeks. "The ranch," she said. "I have enough from the estate settlement for the purchase and enough left to work it for a year before it needs to pay for itself. I filed the guardianship for Thomas and Lily. I'm staying." Rhett had his hands in his coat pockets. He was looking at the ridge the way he looked at things he was thinking through. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying." She looked at him. "Aldis is going to need a sheriff when his leg heals and he decides he's ready to retire, which by his own estimate is somewhere between 1 and 3 years from now. That seems like the kind of job that would suit a man who is apparently incapable of walking past a problem without trying to fix it." He looked at her. Something in his expression was doing what it sometimes did, several things at once, none of them entirely legible. "You're offering me a job," he said. "I'm pointing out that a job exists," she said. "What you do with the information is your business." He was quiet for a moment. The cold moved across the yard between them. Somewhere behind the house, Lily was talking to Nora in the particular way Lily talked to people she'd decided she liked, rapidly, without pausing for breath, about several things simultaneously. "The ranch is going to be a lot of work," Rhett said. "I'm aware of that. Fences and a south pasture and 2 kids who've had a complicated year." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm not confused about what I'm choosing." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything that would have translated well into plain language. Some things between 2 people who have been through something real together don't require plain language. They require only the acknowledgement that the thing happened, and that both of you are still standing, and that standing together seems, on balance, better than standing apart. "The fence on the south pasture," he said. "I'm good with fences." "I'll remember that," she said. She went back to the estate one final time, alone, in the last days of February before the paperwork transferred ownership and strangers would begin making decisions about what to keep and what to clear. She did not go through the rooms or open drawers or look for anything. There was nothing left to find and nothing she wanted to take. She went to the small sitting room that had been Clara's, now stripped of everything except the furniture that had come with the house, and she stood in it for a while. She took out the handkerchief with the embroidered C. She held it. The room was cold and empty and entirely ordinary looking, and that was the most honest thing about it. How ordinary a space can look when you know what happened in it. How nothing shows on the outside of things. How you can walk through a door and have no idea what it has already cost someone. She thought about the nature of what Clara had tried to do. Not heroic, exactly. Clara had been frightened. She had hesitated. She had asked Mrs. Dodd for help and been turned away and written in tiny handwriting in a journal she hid behind a false back because she had no other way to say what was happening to her. She was not a woman from a story who acted without fear. She was a woman who acted despite it, in the limited ways available to her, with what she had. That was the thing that mattered, Evelyn thought. Not the grand gesture, not the moment of unambiguous courage. Those were rare, and not always where the weight actually lived. The weight lived in the small, persistent choices. In the tea poured out rather than drunk. In 3 words, written on the last page when there was no time left. In Mrs. Dodd's 7 words at a kitchen door. In a 9-year-old packing 2 bags in the dark because someone had told him a wagon was coming. People were not often given the luxury of acting without fear. They were given instead the choice of whether to act at all. Clara had made her choice. So had Decker. So had Mrs. Dodd. So eventually had all the people who sat on those benches and decided not to keep their heads down anymore. Evelyn had made hers 26 days ago, on a frozen road in the dark, walking away from an estate she was supposed to disappear into. She had not been certain, then, that it would come to anything. She had been afraid and tired, and she had walked toward the lights of a town 3 miles away because it was the only option she could find, and that was enough. It was always enough, just to choose the next thing you could actually do. She folded the handkerchief one more time and put it in her coat pocket, where it had lived for 26 days, where she intended to keep it. Not as a relic or a weight, but as a reminder of the specific quality of a person who had tried, which was the most honest memorial she could offer. She left the sitting room. She walked down the hallway and through the front door and down the steps and across the frozen ground toward the gate, and she didn't look back at the house. The ridge road stretched ahead of her toward town. The sky was beginning to clear for the first time in days, the gray pulling back to show something pale and cold and real behind it. 15 miles east, past the second ridge, a ranch sat in a valley waiting for someone to come fix its fences. She had a long walk back to town and a great deal to do. And the rest of it, whatever it was, whatever shape it took when she wasn't looking directly at it, would come together the way things do when you've stopped trying to control every piece of it and started simply living in the direction you've decided to face. Her sister's name was Clara. She had been 26 years old, and she had been brave in the ways she could be, and she had tried to do something that mattered. Someone had finished it for her. That was enough. That was finally and completely enough.